Stephen in conversation with.
28 minutes now to 9 the time. Good morning to you. Time for In Conversation this Friday morning. Okay, so you'll know that there have been all sorts of plans. The world was moving in a certain way. And then over the last month, a series of events has happened that no one really could have predicted. Maybe one or two people did. I certainly didn't. And I'm talking about the fact that because a virus moved from the animal world to human beings in, we think, a market in Wuhan in China, and from there moved around the world. Over half of the world's population, 3.9 billion people, as I speak to you now, are living under some form of lockdown, and you're one of them, because of the spread of the COVID-19 virus. At the moment, over 1 million people have this disease. So 1 million people actually have the virus at this stage. It is a staggering number. It's 1,015,466 people at this stage. 53,190 have died. And you'll know, of course, that some people are more vulnerable than others in terms of the elderly. So then, what does this do to what we thought was going to be the future of the world? If the world was moving in a particular way, how has it now changed? Well, Graeme Codrington is a South African author, futurist and strategy consultant, and he's agreed to discuss all of this with us In Conversation this morning. Graeme, good morning. Thank you for your time.
Good morning, Stephen. Nice to be chatting.
Okay, firstly, let's just turn the clock back to the end of last year. So just a couple of months ago now, I mean, the World Health Organization was first notified of this virus on the 31st of December last year. So let's go back to, say, Christmas last year, right? What were the main dynamics that were shaping the world? I suppose the question really is, what were the main trends that were pushing us in certain directions as a planet?
Can anyone remember Christmas last year? It feels like a lifetime ago now, already, doesn't it?
It really does, yes.
But, I mean, the headlines were obvious to remember. Remember, there was Brexit, and that was going to be the big thing that the British and the European Union had to deal with. How do you deliver this impossible request to extract the UK out of the EU? If we look at the other big countries, if we just move our way around the map, we were seeing some fascinating things happening with some of the world's biggest countries. So Putin and Modi and Xi and Trump were all looking as if they were heading in authoritarian directions. Xi in China and Putin in Russia were both on the pathway, and they still both are, of trying to extend their terms beyond the constitutional limits. Modi was implementing some really tough and rough policies around, especially being anti-Muslim in India. And Trump also had a little bit of an authoritarian look around him. We can then look, if we look in the southern hemisphere, you had a similar look and feel in places from Indonesia to Brazil. So there was a very interesting shift already beginning to take place in significant countries in the world, where I suppose it's a historical trend, Stephen. We always, as humanity, try to balance individual freedoms versus societal benefits. And I think history shows us that we literally over centuries go backwards and forwards between complete freedom and letting everybody do what they want to do versus then coming back towards some central control and sort of move between them. And I think last year and the year before, the world was on that move again. And that included things like nationalism and xenophobia and so on. So we mustn't look back and romanticize what was going on in the world. I think big shifts were already in play.
In the meantime, a lot of this was driven by economics. So China and the rise of China, I mean, easily, I remember speaking to the historian and writer Francis Fukuyama a few years ago, and I asked him, what is the biggest trend that's happening in the world right now from a sort of a long-term historical point of view? And he said it was so easy, the growth of the middle class in China. Millions of people, I mean, literally hundreds of millions of people coming out of poverty, and that also led to a dependency by the West on manufacturing in China.
And we were seeing the same thing beginning to happen in Southeast Asia, of course. So that the Chinese dragon, if you like, had spilled over with positive effects. South Korea, it being a leading light there, but other countries in Southeast Asia, Vietnam Cambodia and others beginning to feel those benefits too. Bizarrely, China was starting to get a bit expensive and also running out of labor. China had just, was it 2 years ago, relaxed their one-child policy because they realized they actually needed more people, which is a strange thing to think of, but they had become the engine house and the supply house of the world. And that was part of what drove Donald Trump to start his trade war against China. It wasn't just about prices and that. It was really about establishing and re-establishing American control over the global economy. And that, to be honest, wasn't going really well. In terms of China had basically said, well, you can try a trade war, but we're not the nation we used to be. We are more powerful. And that was busy playing itself out last Christmas as well, as we were sort of waiting to see who blinked first there. So again, you're absolutely right. There had been over 10 or 20 years, but accelerating in the last few years, the obvious shift of economic power around the world.
Okay, so then have all of these factors, so nationalism, the tension between democracy and freedom, or rights and freedom, and dictatorship, however we want to call it, central authorities may be a better phrase, the rise of China, the shift to Asia, the weakening of America, Brexit, have all of those things been weakened or affected or strengthened by COVID-19?
Sure, that's a fascinating question, and I remember the great scenario planner, Clem Sunter. I think he's one of the only Western people to have ever gone and done scenarios directly for the Chinese government. I remember him telling a story of asking a Chinese official what the impact of the French Revolution had on China. And the Chinese official responded to him, "It's too soon to say."
It's a steal from Winston Churchill, yes.
And, I think it's too soon to say, but I do think we can speculate, and I think we can even look in the short term to see some immediate shifts. So a simple example that maybe people will see immediately. China obviously dealt with the virus quite quickly and vigorously, and that's one of the upsides, if we have to be honest, of having an authoritarian government, is you can impose things quite quickly on a massive population. But the upside of that is that they are coming out of lockdown at the moment. They're releasing travel restrictions. People are going back to work. China is essentially ready for business again. Everybody else is either in lockdown or still about to go into lockdown. So America kind of technically hasn't really started lockdown yet. Some states have, but other states haven't. And we're learning in South Africa, if only a few people are locked down, well, then it doesn't really matter. We're not technically locked down yet. So America has to start lockdown, and that's going to take a few months out of their economy. China's ready for business. What happens then when, say, we in South Africa come out of lockdown in a few weeks' time and we say, I need some goods, please. I need to trade. I need some supplies. And our suppliers used to be in Europe, in Italy, in Spain, and they're in America. Now China's the only person open for business. This could dramatically, in the very short term, change global supply chains, change economic partnerships. And I think China's already indicating that they know this and they're ready for business, especially with Africa. We've seen them reaching out already, Jack Ma as an individual, but the Chinese government as a policy really reaching out to connect and support and supply Africa.
At the same time, though, I mean, a lot of supply chains that were reliant on China before this would have been badly disrupted by what happened. Does this mean, and I mean, there's this famous slogan, designed in California, made in China, right?
Yes.
That model surely is going to be disrupted. So we might see different effects. So, for example, Germany is famously has sort of mid-sized engineering firms. I think they call it the Mittelstand or something. And basically they provide the world with sort of good quality manufacturing goods in a certain way. So we might find that if they go under lockdown, China can steal that market. But could we find, say, Apple feels, actually, we can't rely just on Asia to manufacture our goods. So we're going to have a factory in Africa too.
Well, that's a really good point. Maybe an example close to home for people. I think people went on that toilet roll rush
Yes.
of buying toilet rolls because they have friends and family in Australia. As far as I understand it, Australia makes none of their own toilet paper, and all of their toilet paper is imported from China and Southeast Asia. And so it was probably actually correct to go and hoard toilet paper in Australia because there was a huge potential for them to run out. Whereas, of course, in South Africa, we have, as far as I know, three, maybe more, significant toilet roll manufacturers. I know there's one in Pretoria, there's another one down in Durban. So we were never going to run out because for us it's local. Now, of course, most people have no idea where their toilet paper comes from, nor where their toothbrushes and toothpastes and even some of their food and so on. And I think we'll probably become more aware of that as citizens. And I think each country around the world might have a conversation around what is strategically better to locate inside your borders and to have a little bit more control over. So that might mean that the trend, a 50-year trend towards globalism, is not halted, but certainly reevaluated as we come out of COVID on the other side. I think that would be one big indication we could be looking for.
Just on this issue around democracy, dictatorship, I mean, people point to China, they point to Rwanda. Those societies have strong leadership at the center who can order people to do certain things. Now, that helps in a time of crisis. We're a very different society to those societies. I don't know if South Africans realize when you walk through a shopping center or a shopping area in Rwanda, there'll be a man with a machine gun and a uniform at each corner. Now, this is a country that recently went through a genocide in living memory, so it's completely understandable, and people accept it. I don't think South Africans would accept it, and you see the current arguments around the police and the soldiers here. Do you think all of this is going to have an impact on us in terms of democracy and freedom, or do you think the trends that we've seen from the start of the adoption of our constitution in 1996 are too strong to stop that from happening?
It's a really difficult question for a middle-aged white man to answer. There's a number of ways to answer that for myself. The first is that, like many presidents around the world, Cyril Ramaphosa is getting a nice big bump in his ratings because in a crisis, when a president stands up and leads, it gives all of us just a sense of breathing space. We just say, oh, at least there's somebody in charge. Later on, we might realize he made bad decisions and good decisions. But in a time of crisis and even despair, you want a strong person who stands up, who's clear, who's decisive, who makes decisions. And from Angela Merkel to President Xi to President Ramaphosa, you are seeing leaders doing that, and they're getting massive bumps in their ratings. If they use that popularity after the event for good, if, for example, after COVID, the government keeps its emergency mindset, which at the moment seems to be producing really good results, and then applies that emergency mindset to education and to the healthcare system in general, and to the economy in order to fix it, well, I don't think any of us would complain. If we saw these big problems we've had for not 25 years, we've had problems for 75, 100 years in this country, in terms of the equitable spread of resources and infrastructure. So if our government fixed that, very few people would complain. But then, Stephen, your and my experience, I think, is of being white people in the suburbs. What must it feel like to be in the township right now when the military comes in? Even if we say the military is there for your good and for your assistance, the flashbacks to somebody of my age and what it was like back in the 1970s and 80s must be, I can't even imagine. And I'm just wondering whether there will be an opportunity, and I hope it's a good opportunity for us to have a real conversation, not a truth and reconciliation conversation, but a new South Africa conversation. That COVID gives us the chance to reset and to really have some conversations maybe we haven't had in the last 25 years about what we want our country to be. And that might mean that we also have a conversation about what type of leadership we want, political leadership in that space. I think we will have that conversation, and I think we will see some quite significant changes.
Graeme Codrington is a South African author, futurist and strategy consultant with us in conversation through until 9 o'clock here on SAFm. It's 17 minutes now to 9. Graeme, one of the things that I think has been so hard for so many people, certainly for me as someone who has been involved in reporting in this country for so long, is how quickly all of this has happened. It's and there's certain phases of it. I mean, it was a story in China you did once a month or once a week, and then it was something that moved, and there was a case in Europe and a case in the United States. And I remember speaking to a man called Cesar Zabir, who is a South African who was in Wuhan at the time when this started, and he was under lockdown. And I just remember thinking, gosh, that must be awful. And now I find myself in lockdown. It's happened so quickly. That speed has led to a sense, I think, of shock, huge shock.
Absolutely. It didn't come as a big surprise to everybody. And I suppose in a sense, this is what I do for a living. My business card has the word futurist on it, which not too many people, I think, understood, because it isn't about predicting the future. I don't have a crystal ball, and you're not able to peg a particular event to a particular date. Nobody can do that. But you can build scenarios. And so, for example, President Obama was asked every now and again by a journalist or a reporter, what do you worry about the most? What keeps you up at night? And his answer was always, for all of the 8 years of his presidency, was a global pandemic. He had access to all sorts of scenario planners who planned out what a nuclear attack by North Korea would look like. What would happen if, China invaded the South China Sea and sparked a war with Japan? What would happen if a terrorist did this or that? And a global pandemic was one of the scenarios that was played out fairly regularly with people thinking, what would it look like? What impact would it have? And President Obama said that was the one that scared him the most. And I heard that a few years ago. And in fact, in our team, we wrote a case study on what a global pandemic looked like if there was a complete lockdown on travel. So we didn't think of lockdown of everybody being confined to their house, but we just thought maybe all the ports and airports would be shut down and there'd be free movement in the cities. And we decided not to publish that case because we thought it was too crazy.
Wow.
In the sense of that, people wouldn't believe it, and it wouldn't help people because you can't plan for that. And that was the point our team got to, is you can't put money aside, you can't put a plan in place from a company perspective or an individual perspective. But it isn't a surprise. There are epidemiologists. There's a word we're all going to learn how to spell and say, and there's going to hopefully be a lot of children who go into it as a career choice now in the future. These are people who study pandemics, epidemics, who understand diseases, and they know what to expect. They know what these models are. And in fact, the best governments in the world, including South Africa's, have listened to those people, and that's why we're in lockdown, because this is what works. This is the response. It is the correct response. In fact, probably it's the only response that we have to this global pandemic. So at one level, it's not a surprise, but at another level, it's a surprise to all of us who weren't epidemiologists or had access to CIA scenarios. And as you say, the speed of it has just been phenomenal. And that's a testament to globalization, the fact that our world just is so globally connected.
I'm going to come back to that issue of connectedness in a moment. 9 minutes now to 9. You at SAFm speaking to Graeme Codrington, the futurist, about all of this. Graeme, I always get irritated when people ask me this question. Someone would say, do you expect a shock, right? And what would that shock be? And you think to yourself, well, how can I answer that? A shock by its nature or a black swan event is something that's completely unexpected. But I'm going to ask you anyway. We've had this massive shock I mean, could it be the harbinger of more kinds of shocks? I mean, might we find, for example, that climate change really comes and smacks us on the head right now at this moment? And I'm sort of reminded of how humanity must have felt 100 years ago, where, you know, you just come out of this massive world war that had involved people from so many nations, not all of them, but certainly from ours. And straight after that, that massive shock, you have the Spanish flu, you know. Sometimes in life, you know, you don't just have one bad thing happen, you have several all at once. So do we need to prepare for more shocks in some way, especially because I imagine states, people themselves, societies, communities, economies could all be weakened by COVID-19 and the lockdown?
Absolutely. Well, let me just quickly scare everybody slightly more with the other two scenarios we thought were too crazy. The first was an asteroid strike. And
I've seen that movie, yes.
Yes, exactly. And the other is a solar flare from the sun that causes an electromagnetic pulse. It's called an EMP that basically wipes every computer on the planet clean. So imagine taking a big magnet across your computer, would just scramble all the data and make your computer and your cell phone and everything else useless. Those are two other scenarios, again, that President Obama and presidents around the world do, in fact, think about. Now, we can't predict those. We don't know. We are overdue for a big solar flare in terms of historical analysis. But, you know, I think that's not quite what your question is. But those, we do have to realize that we live on a fragile planet, tiny blue dot in the middle of a universe that's reasonably hostile to us. And these things can happen. And our generation hasn't experienced one, and I think sort of every 3 or 4 generations has one of these big global reset shift moments. But you're absolutely right to look back 100 years. Futurists actually spend quite a lot of time reading history because we want to see these patterns. And the pattern after the First World War and the Spanish flu and the pattern after the Second World War is very interesting. The pattern involved, we dealt with the crisis. We will get over this crisis. We will deal with it. Worst case scenario, it's a year until we get the vaccine. We know what this virus looks like. It's not out of our understanding, so we just need to take the time it takes to get a vaccine. So we dealt with it. Humanity comes out and basically has a big party, the roaring 20s of the 1920s. And there's a bit of release. And then because we didn't build a solid foundation to our economy again, there's an even worse crash after that. And because of that, there was a rise of fascism and dictators, and that led to the next World War. Now, I'm not saying that's the pattern, and I'm not saying that will happen again. But what I am saying is there will be. There is no doubt already that COVID-19 will bring a reset and a reshift or a shift in power dynamics, political power, social power, economic power. And so I think the message that people already need to be getting into their heads as they sit in lockdown this morning in South Africa is we can't wait to go back to normal. There will be no normal after this. A new normal emerges. If we are unaware of that new normal, we might create even bigger problems for ourselves in the next 10 years. We have to come out of this COVID crisis thinking and talking and engaging as a society with what do we want the new normal to look like, rather than saying, quickly, let's go back to the old normal.
Graeme, we've got 5 minutes left, and I've got 2 big questions for you. Okay, so let's see if we can get through both of them. The first is something that changed over the last 50 years was air travel and the price of air travel. Now, it's still out of reach of most people in South Africa, but in many other places it's not. So, for example, people in Europe or London would sometimes go to New York for a weekend, you know, just a long weekend, because it was actually that cheap. It was only 6 hours, etc. It changed the world in so many ways. It did make it more productive. We mustn't forget that people would go to conferences, they'll go to meetings, they'll come here for a conference, they'll keep their family on for a holiday afterwards. Presumably air travel now could be changed forever, and that is going to have a big impact on the interconnectedness, the physical contact between people.
Absolutely. So there's a few things to think about here quickly. So the first is this COVID-19 is not going to be the last coronavirus. It's just the next in a progression of coronaviruses that are mutating to come to humans. So we now know that we live in a world where global pandemics are possible. And just like after 9/11, we all had to reduce the liquids we took on planes and take our shoes off when we went through American airports. I wonder whether for the next 10 or 20 years, you might have to take some kind of health certificate with you, and that certain people may not be allowed to travel because they either haven't had COVID yet or haven't been vaccinated. So I think air travel will become more difficult. Whether it becomes cheaper or more expensive, I'm not sure, but it'll certainly, I think, people will travel less because it's more difficult and more dangerous to travel. I also think that people who are working at home from now, they might have traveled overseas 5, 6, 10 times a year to conferences, visit suppliers. They're not able to do that now, but they're realizing actually you can have a Zoom call or whatever, a Skype call with my suppliers, and it's actually adequate. And so I might only do one trip overseas. And I think we're going to see the patterns of international travel change quite significantly because of this. And that, of course, is also, we're going to see a few this crisis, they're not going to come back after the lockdown, sadly. So there will just be less people flying and less airlines flying them around.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes left for the last big question, Graeme. Before COVID-19, despite everything that you see and hear in the news, the world was becoming a better place. If you look at life expectancy, health, the fact that there's simply fewer wars and conflicts than there used to be, and there really are fewer wars and conflicts than there used to be. Millions of people coming out of poverty in India, in China, other countries in that region. Also here, we shouldn't forget, the world was getting better. Will that process continue after COVID-19?
I really hope so. And let's end with this on a South African thought. Pick one example. We were having a conversation about NHI. And there were some people, especially, let's say, richer people in their suburban homes with their private healthcare saying, why do we need NHI? And why are we putting this burden on the country? Well, now we understand, don't we? I am only as protected as the poorest person in this country. The richest person in South Africa can get COVID from the poorest person. We now know why we need NHI. And I hope that we come out of the COVID crisis thinking about this new normal, but with a sense of global community, or at least a country community, that says we've got to create a better new normal for South Africa. And NHI might be one of the things that gets a big boost from this because of a changed attitude that we all get through this period of lockdown.
Okay. And do you think the world's going to continue to get a better place?
Maybe not for the next 2 or 3 years. It's going to be a tough economic situation. But 10 years from now, yes, definitely.
All right. Graeme Codrington, I really appreciate the time. Thank you so much. So much wisdom coming there from Graeme Codrington, South African author, futurist and strategy consultant, and so many things to think about as well. All right. So it is, I know it doesn't feel like it, but it is a Friday. Bongi Gwala is with you next. I'll be with you and with the team on Monday, and I've really enjoyed being with you over the last little while. So yeah, have a good weekend. Stay safe, please. Speak to your parents. Make sure that they're safe as well. You with SAFm leading the conversation. It's 9 o'clock.
Independent and impartial. This is SAFm News.